If you've got a couple balls of yarn and a couple hours, you can crochet our super easy 2-hour stocking. Hey there, I'm Jess from Make and Do Crew, and whether you are looking for an easy project you can bust out a bunch of for your next craft fair, or you have a big family and you need to whip up an easy stocking for each member of your family, I think you're gonna love this project that you can finish seriously in just one evening. So go ahead and hit that like button and come on in to Santa's Crochet Shop. For these 2-hour stockings, we are going to be using Lion Brand Wool-Ease Thick and Quick. So this is a perennial favorite of a lot of crocheters because it makes your projects go so fast, and it's got this beautiful kind of natural texture, but it's also washable and wears really well. So if you don't have access to Wool-Ease Thick and Quick, you are just looking for a similar Category 6 super bulky yarn. That's what's going to help this project go quickly. And one thing to note specifically about Wool-Ease Thick and Quick is that some of the colorways come with 140 grams in the ball, and some of them come with 170. So you are going to need approximately 340 grams in order to complete your stocking. And that means if you have a color that comes with 170 grams in your ball, you're going to need 2 balls. Or if you have one that comes with 140 grams in the ball, then you're going to need 3 balls. If you only have about 280 grams because you're using a colorway that only has 140 grams and you only have 2 balls, your stocking can be a bit shorter. It'll be about 4 or 5 inches shorter. But the main thing to keep in mind is that if you want to make the full size stocking that's pictured, you're going to need about 340 grams or about 210 yards of yarn. We're also going to be using a size N crochet hook that's 10 millimeters, and the gauge doesn't matter a ton on this, but if you're noticing that your stitches are really loose, you're going to want to size down to a smaller hook because we want them to be fairly dense so that your stocking doesn't stretch out. In addition, you'll need a couple of stitch markers just to keep track of where you are in the pattern, and a tapestry needle to weave in your ends. I love to combine different textures with my crochet projects whenever I can. So in this video, I'll also show you how to create a leather loop to hang your stocking when it's complete. And for that, I'm going to be using some old leather belts. I love to look for these at thrift stores, and I'm looking for ones that maybe don't look perfect. Maybe they're not your ideal belt to wear, but they look perfectly broken in to add that rustic patina to your crochet projects. So I'll show you that at the end. You'll need about 9 inches of leather to create your hanging loop. So you either need 9 inches of a belt, or you can use a piece of leather if you have a piece of suede or something leather that you're willing to cut up. You'll need a rectangle that's about 9 inches long. For my hanging loop, I'm going to be sewing it on with a contrasting color of embroidery floss, so that's something that you can use too. Of course, you can also use yarn if that's what you'd prefer. As you crochet, you'll want to follow along with the written pattern, and you can find a link to that right below this video. We're going to begin at the toe section and create a magic ring. This is sometimes also called a magic loop. So I'm just creating a loop here with my working yarn on the top, and I'm just going to grab that working yarn and pull up a loop. And it can feel like a lot to hold, but it gets easier very quickly. So we're just going to chain 1 to close that up, and I'm kind of cinching it down. And from here we want to chain 3. I like to make these quite tight because I find that height matches my double crochet a little bit better and is a more invisible turning chain. So now we should have 3 chains here. We have that one that closes the magic loop, 3 here. This is going to count as our first double crochet, and we want to add 7 more double crochet into this magic ring. So there's 1, 2, 3. You can continue like this until you have 7 double crochet. And I always encourage you to double check that stitch count in the first round because it'll make all the difference as you work toward certain numbers of stitches as we proceed. So you want to make sure you have 8 here. That's counting this first turning chain plus 7 more double crochet. And you can see I tightened down my magic ring a bit. If you haven't done that yet, just untangle that starting strand of yarn and you can sort of tighten it down by just pulling on it like that. We want to close it as much as possible. circle. And now we're going to join the last stitch of the round to the top of the first stitch. So because that first stitch was a turning chain, you can either just insert your hook under the entire turning chain, or you can really specifically put your hook into the top chain there. Then you just want to pull up a loop and pull it through the loop that's on your hook. That's called a slip stitch. So now, if you would like, you can put a stitch marker there in your slip stitch so that you know it's not a stitch and you know where the end and beginning of the round is. This isn't essential. You should be able to see where the round ends and begins, but it can be helpful to remind yourself not to work in that slip stitch. Now we're going to do 3 chains again, and this was our right side round. These double crochets are facing us, so now we're going to turn and work back in the opposite direction. So I've already chained 3 here. That is our first stitch, and we're just going to pop over this slip stitch here. We don't need to work into it. And we're going to, in the first full stitch we can see, we want to put 2 double crochets. In this round, we're going to be working 2 double crochets into each stitch. So I'll address this turning chain when I come back around and finish the round, but for now, we want to put just 2 stitches in each of our stitches from the last round. And as we come upon the end of this round, we worked our chain 3 right here. And so all the other stitches got 2 double crochets. And now we need to put 1 more double crochet here to pair it with our turning chain to make that set of 2. So this should create a total of 16 stitches in this round, including your turning chain. And when I'm counting these stitches, I like to count the posts of them. So that means this vertical part rather than the top, because it can sometimes feel a little confusing about the turning chain. It often confuses me. So I just count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 like that. And like I said, getting this math right is just going to help you. It's kind of like a mile marker for you to check and make sure you're on track as you go. And here we're going to end this round just like we did before, where we're just slip stitching either under that turning chain or into it. And I just want to fasten it together like that. It can be helpful to put that stitch marker again in your slip stitch, just to remind yourself that that is not a stitch to work into. And it also shows you where the round begins and ends. So sometimes that can be helpful. And we're now going to work back in the opposite direction. So this was a wrong side round, and we're going to turn and work a right side round. And the way I can always tell this is a right side round is because I'm looking at the first round of my project, and that was a right side round. So when I see the front of it, I know I'm back to the right side. Again, we're going to start with 3 chains. I'm tightening them down. We're going to turn our work here. I'm going to skip over that slip stitch again because it doesn't count as a stitch in what I'm working on here. And instead, I just want to put 2 double crochet into my first stitch. And then I'll put 1 double crochet in the next stitch. So we're going to repeat a pattern here where I work 2 stitches, then 1, and then 2 stitches in the next stitch. 1 and 2, and then 1 stitch, and we're just going to repeat that same sequence all the way around, alternating 2 stitches and then 1 stitch and 2 and 1. And we're going to do that until we get to the end of this round. At the end of this round, I want to point out how we continue in the pattern. So I have worked 2 double crochets, then 1, and then I have 1 really clear stitch remaining. So in order to stay in our pattern repeat here, I'm going to put 2 double crochets in this stitch. And obviously the next thing that would happen is we would work 1 double crochet, but because we started this round with our turning chain, that counts as our 1 double crochet for this stitch. So you should count your stitches, and now there should be 24 double crochet, including that turning chain. And if that's where you're at, you're good to go to just slip stitch to join your round. Again, pop that stitch marker in your slip stitch if you would like. And we're going to do 1 more round like this where we chain 3, and we are going to turn, work back in the opposite direction. And just like last round, in our first stitch, we're going to put 2 double crochets. And we're doing the same thing we did last round where we're increasing every few stitches, but now instead of doing 2 stitches and then 1 stitch and 2 stitches and 1, we're now going to do 2 stitches here and then work 3 double crochets. So these are just 3 double crochets in the next 3 stitches. And now we're going to repeat that. So 2 double crochets in the next stitch. And then in the next 3 stitches, we're just going to put 1 double crochet. And then you're just going to continue in that pattern of working 2 double crochets in 1 stitch and then 1 double crochet in each of the next 3 stitches. You're going to do that around the rest of this round, and we'll meet back here and talk about how to finish it. At the end of the round, I've just worked 2 double crochets in this stitch, and then I just want to point out how this finishes. We're just going to put 1 double crochet in the next stitch, 1 double crochet in the stitch after that, and then our turning chain from the beginning of the round completes this sequence. So we should still be in that pattern where we have 2 stitches and then followed by 3 double crochet. So at this point you should have a total of 30 stitches, and again we're going to slip stitch to join this. This is a great time just to check the tension of your stitches and your fabric. It shouldn't be so tight that it feels like a piece of armor, but we're also not going for really loose open stitches because that won't create a very structured stocking when it's hanging from your mantle. So while the gauge doesn't matter completely, you're going for a tension that looks like this. And if you're finding yours super loose, my suggestion unfortunately would be to tear this out and work these 4 rounds again with a smaller hook size, because that will create more tension and a little bit tighter stitches for your stocking. On our 5th round, we're going to introduce something called post stitches. And what that means is that instead of inserting our hook through this top V of our stitch, we're going to be working around the post of the stitch in the round below. So that's this vertical section. And that is what's going to create this nice ribbed texture. If you've ever worked crochet ribbing with post stitches, it's the same concept, only we're doing it in an entire stocking. To begin round 5, we're going to start with 3 chains, just like we have all along, and then I'm going to flip because I want the right side of my work facing. So my circle is kind of inside out at this point, but technically this is the right side of my fabric. And we're going to begin with a front post double crochet. So what that means is we're working from the front to the back. When we say front post, it's from the front to the back. So I'm just going to yarn over, and instead of inserting my hook up here, as I said in those V's, we're instead going to work around this post, and we're going to work from the front to the back and then insert our hook back out. So we're working around the post, grabbing a loop and pulling it up. You usually have to pull these up just a little bit higher than you typically would, because your loop needs to reach all the way up to the row or round above. But now I'm just going to yarn over to do the first 2 loops and then yarn over again to complete my double crochet. So that is a front post double crochet, and you can see we already have the basis of a rib right here. So now we need a back post double crochet, and because it's a back post stitch, we're going to insert our hook from the back to the front. So again, I'll start with a yarn over and work from the back here, insert my hook from the back out to the front because I want to work around this post, insert it back through. So now it's coming back out, it's on the back of my fabric because this is a back post stitch. I'm going to grab my working yarn and pull it through. This often benefits from a little hook twisting as you go, so you'll get good at grabbing your yarn and pulling it through, and that will often take a little bit of twirling like this. So now I'm going to yarn over and pull through the first 2 loops on my hook and yarn over and pull through the next 2. So that completes my double crochet. So now we have a front post stitch and a back post stitch, and now we're going to repeat that process around our circle. So a front post, again, is a yarn over like this. We're working from the front to the back because it's a front post stitch. I'm going to work from the front through the back and then back out to the front. And then my working yarn is just sort of reaching over right here, and I'm yarning over to pull it up, Now I have 3 loops on my hook, yarn over to go through 2, and then yarn over to go through the last 2. My front post stitch is complete, so let's do a back post stitch. I'm going to yarn over, work from the back in between the next 2 stitches, or the existing stitch and the next stitch, up to the front, back to the back. So a back post stitch, we're always grabbing our yarn on the back side of our work, pull it up like this, yarn over and pull through 2, yarn over and pull through 2 again. So we're repeating those 2 stitches all the way around. So because we just did a back post, now we're going to do a front post stitch like this, and then a back post stitch. I tend to think of these as sort of slow to work, but whenever I make a project that I do several rounds of these, I realize they actually go so quickly once I just get in the routine of working from the front and then from the back. So I think you'll find a similar rhythm after you work them for a little while and you kind of get the hang of them. They're quite quick, especially with a super thick yarn. So we're going to continue like this around our circle, and then I will meet up with you right here at the end of our round, and you should be ending right here with a front post stitch because our chain 3 is going to just count as our back post stitch. So let's work on that, and I'll see you in a second. Here we are at the end of that round, and this is my front post stitch and this is my turning chain. So if you can see here, that turning chain is sort of receding into the background like a back post stitch. So it's actually going to complete our pattern of front and back posts by serving as a back post double crochet. So now we just need to slip stitch to join and end this round. And once again, if you'd like, you can put your stitch marker there. And we are now going to work several rounds in this front and back post stitch pattern that we just established. And it's a lot easier from now on because we can just look at the stitch below to determine if we need to work a front or a back post stitch. So again, I'm chaining 3 and then I'm going to work in the opposite direction. So this chain 3 is going to count as my first stitch, and it's stacked right on top of my other chain 3s. And from here we want to look at the previous round to tell if we should be doing a back post stitch or a front post stitch. And the general rule is that we're looking at the stitches that are falling back. They look like they're in the background, receding a little, and we're going to do a back post stitch on those. And then the stitches that are creating a little ridge toward the front of the fabric, those are the ones that we do our front post stitch on. So it's just continuing in the ribbed pattern. And I think this will make a lot more sense as we create a few stitches and you see how our next round of stitches here just accentuates the pattern we've already established. So I'm going to start with a yarn over and a back post stitch because this is one of those background stitches. So I'm just working from the back to the front and pulling up a loop and then completing my double crochet. And now the next stitch, because this ridge is toward the front here, I'm going to work a front post stitch, and I'm just working under the post from the previous round. So it's even easier to do once we have worked a couple rounds because it's almost lifted up already. And you can see here, this is just perpetuating this ribbed bar. So at any point, if you start to see something that's interrupting that, that would indicate a mistake. If you get off track and you start to do a back post here, it's not going to look like a continuous bar. We want all of our background stitches to continue to stay in the background and all of our ribbed stitches to continue to lift off the fabric. So from here, we're just going to complete the same pattern all the way around where we do a front post stitch and then a back post stitch like I just did. Then this is a front post stitch because it's bumping out toward me. And then we're going to do a back post stitch and we're going to continue like this around the entire circle. Now I just completed my last stitch of this round where I can really work around a post. So that was a back post stitch, and I'm just going to slip stitch to my turning chain to finish this round off. And we're going to continue now until we have 12 total rounds in our toe. So that means you should have 6 rounds now, and you want to work 6 more, continuing in this pattern. And when I say continuing in this pattern, that simply means that we are going to be doing front post stitches every time we see this little bump toward the front, and then a back post stitch every time we see a valley. So that means on right side rounds, like we're about to work right now, I'm going to start with a front post stitch because my first stitch I can work into is bumping out like this. But of course, if I were going to do a wrong side round, we are going to start with a back post stitch. And that is simply just the nature of flipping this around, and all the stitches that look raised on the inside of our stocking look sunken in on the outside. So that's just the nature of ribbing. And from here, we want to just ensure that we're turning our work at the end of each round, because then we will be in good shape to just continue working post stitches like this until you have a total of 12 rounds from the beginning of the toe. I find that it can be a little tricky to count your stitches, so I want to give you a few pointers here. Obviously, you can just count your rounds of double crochet. You should have 3 very visible rounds of double crochet in your toe. And then the 4th round is where it looks like the ribbing begins, because although we actually started on the 5th round, we are reaching down into the 4th round. So here is my 4th round where I start to see these bumps develop. And then I find it easier to actually just count the top right here, because that allows me to see the top of each row. So I actually like to sort of open up my valley here and count the rows like this. Then it's easier for me to tell how many rounds I've worked. And one tip is just to know that your 12th round, you should have the wrong side facing on that round. So when you complete that wrong side round and you count 12 rounds like this, then we will be all done with the toe and ready to start our heel. As I come upon the end of round 12, I have my stocking right side facing out. So if you're confused at all, look at that very first round. You should see the right side, the front of your double crochets there. And then we're going to slip stitch this to finish it off. And now we're going to begin the heel section. So in order to work the heel, we're just going to be working back and forth in a few rows here, only working around about half of our total circle. So instead of working in rounds, we're now doing rows, and this is the one point in the pattern where our chains at the beginning are not going to count as a stitch. So we're just starting with 2 now, and the reason we're doing this is I found it leaves a little less of a gap at this intersection of the heel as we're working our stocking. We don't want any treats falling out of our stockings, so we're just going to chain 2. We're not treating that as a stitch. So now we're going to double crochet into the next stitch. And you'll see here, I have my slip stitch right here. This is where we joined the last round. We don't want to work in that. That's just that slip stitch. If you're at all confused, put a marker in it after you work it so you know to skip it. But then in our first stitch here, we're going to double crochet. And then we want to work 14 total double crochet. So you should have those 2 chains at the beginning, and then work in the next 14 stitches with a regular double crochet. We're not doing the post stitch stuff right now. We're just working double crochet stitches. And when you have a 14 double crochet, we are going to turn and work in the opposite direction. Again, we're going to chain 2 at the beginning of row 2. I'm turning my work here, and I want to work into my first stitch here. Because this is not counting as a stitch, we're going to work into the top of this double crochet. So we've got 1 there, and we should be working across until we have 14 total double crochet. As we come to the end of this row, I just want to give you a heads up on where you're inserting your hook in the last stitch. So you can see here, I have this double crochet, so I'm going to work into the top of it. That will give me a total of 14 double crochet in this row. And we're not going to work into the top of this turning chain specifically because it's not counting as a stitch. So you should have the chain 2 at the beginning of the row, and then 14 double crochet across, and we're going to repeat that same thing once more. So 2 chains at the beginning and work into my first stitch with a double crochet, and then double crochet across the row. At the end of row 3, again, we should have those chain 2, 14 double crochet across, and now we're going to seam up the back edge here to complete the heel. In order to do that, we want to turn our slipper wrong side out. So I'm folding this inside out now, and we're going to fold over our last row here so that the stitches are lined up. So you want to have your first stitch right here, or I should say the last stitch of your row, lined up with the first stitch right here. If you find it easier to keep your stitches lined up stitch for stitch, you can use stitch markers, or you can just hold on to it. We are going to do this seaming with our crochet hooks. So we're going to use slip stitches, and we want to chain 1 at the beginning, and then we're going to work under both loops of my first stitch here, right here, and then my first stitch over here. So we should now have our first loop that was originally on the hook, and then we've worked through 2 stitches, and I'm just going to pull up a loop so I have 2 on my hook, and then pull 1 through the other. That's a slip stitch, and again I'm going to work under both loops of this stitch, both loops of the next stitch, pull my yarn through, and then pull it through the loop on my hook. When we're doing this, we want to pull it tight enough that there aren't big gaps in the seam. It's not too loose, but we also don't want to cinch it down so tight that this area puckers. So it's just about giving an even tension, and I'm working stitch for stitch, slip stitching as I go. And when we get down to the bottom here, you may not be able to work into this very last stitch. That's okay, it's not going to create a big hole. And now you can either kind of tuck it in here like that, and if you want, you could fasten off your yarn here and weave in this yarn tail. But if you are like me and want to avoid weaving in yarn ends, what I like to do is just chain a couple stitches like this to give my yarn a bit of length, and then I'm just going to work under one of these loops here and slip stitch in order to tack my working yarn down, and then do it again right here, just work under a loop or 2. I'm just essentially going back up the heel, working really pretty loose slip stitches. If you're familiar with sewing, this is kind of like a basting step. So I'm just moving my yarn back up here because where I want to have my yarn positioned to start my next round of the boot or ankle section is right here between the seam. So if you would prefer to fasten off and weave in that end and reattach your yarn, you want to reattach it right in the center of your seam. But if, like me, you just kind of slip stitch it back up so that you don't have to fasten off, you can turn your stocking right side out again. It's looking quite like a little slipper, isn't it? It's very cute. To begin round 1 of our boot, we are going to be working with a right side round. So if you remember, in our previous rounds down here in the toe section, we had 30 stitches, and we're going to create 32 stitches now, working around this opening at the ankle. And we're going to continue working in post stitches now, but we first need to establish some double crochets right here along the side of the heel on this side and on this side. So to begin, we are going to chain 3 again, like we were before, and we want to work 8 total double crochet on this side of the heel. So we have our turning chain here, that's our first double crochet, and I want to evenly place 7 more double crochet in the space between our seam and the beginning of our post stitch toe. I have 7 double crochet here, including my turning chain, and I'm choosing to work my 8th double crochet right into this space here. It really doesn't matter where you place them. The intention is more that your stitches look evenly spaced. So I might have a gap, a little bit of a gap right here if I don't work a stitch in here. So I'm going to place my last double crochet there. And now we want to work into all the stitches that were unworked when we made our heel. So you should have a total of 16 stitches going across what is essentially the top of the foot. And now we're going to work in post stitches again. You can look at the stitches to know if it's a front or back post stitch. This first one is obviously front post because it's bumping out toward me. So I'm just going to work that front post stitch in that stitch. Now we've got a back post stitch. And again, a front post stitch. We're going to work across the top of this foot section, and I will show you where to work your last stitch because it can be a little hard to spot. And as always, if you have questions about this, come over to our Facebook group. It's such a friendly, nice group of crocheters and knitters, and you can ask your questions in our group. Or if you don't have questions, but you just want to show off your cool stocking project, we love to see that too. I get so thrilled when I see all the cool things that you make from our patterns. And here at the end of the top of my foot, I have this stitch right here. This was a turning chain way long ago when we were working our toe section. And I want to point out that that's going to be your last stitch across this top. So that's your 16th double crochet. And because it's receding to the back, we're going to do a back post stitch there. So that completes the top of the foot. At this point you should have 24 stitches, and we're now going to work 8 more double crochet across the side of our heel here. Just like we did to start this round, you're just going to work 8 double crochet, space them as easily as possible, and you should then reach this end of your round right here where we began with our seam. Once you are sure you have 32 stitches, including that turning chain here, we are going to just slip stitch to the top of it to join our round. And now we're going to work just like we did in our toe section, where we do those front and back post stitches around and around. So I've got 3 chains there. That's my first double crochet. So I'm going to not do anything with this turning chain that's in the round below, but right here in my next double crochet stitch, I want to begin this round with a front post double crochet. So we're going to be establishing that post stitch pattern in the back of the heel section now, where we just put our new double crochets. I began with a front post stitch. Now I'm doing a back post stitch, and we're going to continue like this and pretty quickly run into the top of our foot section. To continue with this wrong side round, you can see I just did a front post stitch, and I'm going to work my back post stitch next, as we do. And now I've reached the top of my slipper or stocking, whatever it looks like to you at this point. So we're just going to continue in the pattern that's established, which should mean that you're working front post stitches on all the ones that are bumping out toward you, and all the ones that are in your valleys, you're going to do back post stitches. And we're going to just work the rest of this round continuing in this pattern. So you should be alternating front and back post stitches. And when you get around to the opposite side of the heel, you're going to continue in that pattern of front and back post stitches to establish the pattern so that we can work several more rounds in front and back post stitches. At the end of our round, our last stitch should be a front post stitch, because if you remember from the toe, this turning chain is counting as our back post stitch because it's sort of falling into the background there. So I'm slip stitching to join this. I'm going to chain 3 to begin my next round and turn and work the opposite direction. So now we have a right side round going, and we're just going to continue repeating back and forth rounds of post stitches now. And that means that the next round here, we want to start it with a back post stitch, because you can see it's a background stitch. It's a valley. So I'm starting here with back post double crochet and then front post double crochet, and we're going to just continue like that, alternating front and back post stitches and alternating right and wrong side rows to complete the boot of our stocking pattern. One thing I want to point out as you finish your right side rounds, so those are the rounds you're going to be ending with a back post stitch. So that means that your turning chain is counting as a front post stitch. If you'd like that to really pop out a little bit more, instead of inserting your hook like this in order to pull the loop through, which sort of pushes that turning chain toward the back, one of the things that you can do is insert your hook from the back to the front like this, and pull your loop through like this to slip stitch, because that pops that stitch out just a little bit and creates a little bit more of a ridge to stay in your pattern of front and back post stitches. And somewhere along the way, I highly recommend trying your stocking on your foot just for the cozy factor, because it is legit like a nice little foot hug. And then take it off and finish off that boot section. After you've been cruising along in some rounds of post stitches, you should have something that looks like this. And I want to pause here and let you know what the stitch marker indicates. This is referring to the height of your stocking if you choose to only use 2 balls of Wool-Ease Thick and Quick and you're using the balls that come with 140 grams. So if you remember back in the supplies section, we chatted about how some balls of Wool-Ease Thick and Quick come with 170 grams. So in that case, you'll need 2 balls to make a tall stocking like this. If you have some of the colorways that come in a little bit smaller balls, so like this one that is 140 grams, if you wanted to stick to only 2 balls of yarn, your stocking would be about this high. So I just wanted to give you a chance to visualize that. In order to make a stocking that is full length like this, if you're using balls that are 140 grams, you're going to need 3 of them. Another way to think about this, and what I was going to mention at the top of this, regardless of the number of balls you're using and the number of grams that come in your ball, is that you are going to work until you have enough yarn left over to work one more edge here. So most cases that will be about 18 rounds here from this section where we reattached our yarn and worked from the heel upward. This is 18 rounds. Somewhere between 16 and 18 rounds is what will give you this height, and you should have enough yarn to create that height if you're using 2 balls of 170 grams. In any case, we want to leave enough yarn that in our final round we can create a finishing border. So when you are getting close to running out of yarn or you're happy with the height, you want to make sure you're ending with a wrong side round. So that means one that you worked with the inside of your stocking facing. And now we're going to work our finishing border with the right side of the stocking facing us, which means we're going to turn and work in the opposite direction as our previous round, just like we have done all along in this pattern. To begin our finishing round, we're going to start with 3 chains, just like we have in all of these rounds. Now I have the right side of my stocking facing, and we're going to skip over that slip stitch as we usually do. And now we're just going to double crochet in each stitch around. So we're not working around any post stitches this time. We're just double crocheting in each stitch, and that's going to create a nice top edge that mimics the look of the toe and the heel stitches. So go ahead and work double crochet stitches around this and then slip stitch to the top of that turning chain to join your round. And now our finishing round is complete. So you have a choice here. You can go ahead and fasten off your yarn if you know that the loop that you're going to add to hang your stocking is going to be made of leather or fabric or some contrasting material. And I'll show you how to make one with leather in just a minute. But if you know that you're going to crochet your loop, then you want to keep your yarn attached. It's right here now at the back seam of the stocking where we've joined all those rounds. And I will show you right now how to crochet a little loop that can hang your stocking from the chimney with care. So we're going to begin with 15 chains, but this is something that you can modify to influence how far your loop hangs down. So if you already know that you need a longer or a shorter loop, then just adjust the number of chains you're starting out with. And this is quite a quick process. So even if you crochet the loop and then realize, oh, it's too long or too short, it's quite easy to modify, especially if it's too long, because you can just tuck more inside the stocking. And if it's too short, you can try again with a longer chain. But my recommendation is to experiment with 15 chains because I found that to be a pretty good length. We're going to divide our row into two sections. The first is going to be working into the top bump of each of these chains, and we're going to attach our yarn sort of down here at the base of our chain and move it across over here so that then we can stitch into each of the bottom bumps of our chain. So that's where we're headed. And to begin, I'm just skipping the first chain here and then single crocheting into the top bump of each of my chains that I have until I get down to the bottom edge where the stocking begins. There we go. Now we want to slip stitch into the edge of the stocking, and you can just work into the first double crochet here. So if we slip stitch like this, we're tacking down this row that we just created. And now we want to work a couple chains, 2 or 3 like this, because we want to be able to move our yarn across this row that we just did and work another slip stitch right here so that we can tack it down. And this is moving our working yarn over here so that we can work along the opposite side of the chain. So when I flip this around, the right side of my stocking is still facing. This is a little twisted up, but you should have something that looks like this. The most important thing here is just that your working yarn is in the correct place to then begin working into the bottom bump of each of your chains. And we're just going to single crochet in each stitch again. This allows us to create a little bit wider loop so that your stocking is hung in a sturdy way and won't sag down too far when it's filled with treats. At this point, you should have something that looks like this, and it's a great idea to just fold it over and make sure you like the length of your loop, knowing it might stretch out a little bit once your stocking is heavy and hanging down. So assess the length, and if you want it shorter, we're just going to tuck it further into the stocking when you seam it in. But if you want it longer, then you're going to have to, unfortunately, tear out this little section, work more chains, and then repeat the last 2 steps that we did where we single crochet into that chain. If you're happy with the length though, then you can fasten off your yarn and pull that tail through. We want to leave a bit of a yarn tail here because we're going to use it for seaming this loop inside the stocking. Go ahead and pop that yarn tail through a tapestry needle, and then we're folding this over, and you can even tuck it into those chain stitches that you created when you worked across the bottom of your chain, like this if you want to. And then we're just going to do a few stitches here, a few whip stitches to tack this down in place. It's a good idea to go back and forth a couple times here just to create the sturdiest join possible. And once you have whip stitched this in place, you can now weave in your end, and then go ahead and weave in any remaining ends inside your stocking. And now I'll show you how to create a leather hanging loop if that's more your style. Okay, this part is so fun. I just love the look of rough leather and yarn together. So I've already measured out 8.5 inches and determined that that is the length of loop I would like. So you can try 8.5 inches and then modify your measurement accordingly depending on how low you want your stocking to hang. I've already marked on my belt here where I want to cut. So you may, depending on the leather that you're using, need a pretty tough pair of scissors. This belt happens to be quite thick, so I'm using these alligator scissors here. And once that is cut, you can decide how you want to sew your loop onto your stocking. In my case, I am going to be working an X shape. So I want to use my embroidery floss to create an X like this to attach this loop to my stocking, which means I'm going to need 4 holes on this side of my leather piece, and then the same thing over here that will line up. So 4 holes over here. I'm going to be using a leather punch to create the holes in my leather, but if you don't have one of these, you can use something like a nail or a screw and then hammer it into your leather to create the holes. That's what I always did before I had this leather punch. You can also pick up one of these at a craft store or on Amazon, and if you do go to Michael's or Joann's, use your coupon because it's the type of thing that is often full price, so it qualifies for that coupon use. And the way that it works is you can choose the size of hole that you want it to punch. So in this case, I've got it set to the smallest hole, and I'm just going to put it in my leather like this. It does take me both hands to be strong enough to push it through, but then it creates a nice little hole like that that I can thread my needle and embroidery floss through. So I'm going to create 4 more of those holes. Once I have my 4 holes established on one side, I want to make sure that my holes are symmetrical on the other side because that's what I'm going to be sewing through. So a trick that I like to do here is just mark them on the opposite side, just right through the hole. So I'm using my pen to draw a little dot, using the existing holes as a guide so I know right where to punch my holes and the placement of them. So now I'm going to punch 4 more holes on the opposite side of the leather. I will say, if you do decide to buy a leather punch, it is a really handy tool if you like to add leather soles to your crochet and knit slippers. And in fact, we have a whole video tutorial on exactly how to do this and a free template so that you can make all of your handmade slippers non-slip. Now I have my holes punched, and we want to place this right at the seam where all of our rounds have been joined. So you should see your turning chain there. And we're going to situate this, kind of cover the join of that final round. So of course the placement of yours can go further down or higher up. Look for what you feel good about. Once you're happy with the placement, you have a good idea of where you want to put it, then it's time to attach your seaming thread. And I have this piece of embroidery floss doubled over, so I have a knot tied at the end here and my tapestry needle here. And I just want to fasten this down inside the stocking here and just get it attached so that it's ready to do my joining. To do that, I am just going to insert my needle and pull it through. And I want to pull it almost all the way through, but catch the middle of that loop right here so that I can attach it, secure it down. You can trim these little tails of thread if you want to, and if you want to make it extra secure, you can do that one more time, where you just pull it through until there's a little loop left and then work your needle through that loop. Okay, now that we have that attached, we're ready to start seaming into the actual holes of the leather. This is a place where you can take some creative liberties, and perhaps you want to sew across with a bar of red right here and a bar of red right here, or you can do it in an X like I'm going to. There's lots of ways to do this, and perhaps if you are making a slightly different look for each stocking, you can personalize this for each person. But we are going to start here with just working the needle through one of those holes. And I want to make sure I'm super happy with the position because it's gonna get a lot trickier to move it once I start doing these stitches. So I personally am just going to go like this in a diagonal, and after I insert my needle, I want it to come back through the same hole on the opposite side. That's obviously what's going to be attaching it here. So I'm just going to work around like this. I'm going from the back, pulling it through that back hole, and then now going through the front. I'm going to do a few passes like this. Make sure it is secure. We don't want any dropped stockings this Christmas. Now, once I've got a few passes of that, I'm going to work my needle into the opposite side over here, and then do a few more passes to complete my X like this. And then I am going to outline my X with some vertical bars. When I'm happy with the look, I better be, because I'm running out of thread. So I am just going to put my needle under one of my loops there, and then I've got a little round loop that I'm going to pull it through. So if you're familiar with creating a sewing knot, that's what I'm doing. I'm just working back through that little loop of my thread so that I can really tie this down. I like to do like 3 or 4 of these in a project where I know it's going to get used frequently. And then I can just snip that thread right off, and our stocking hook is complete. I hope you love how your chunky stocking turned out, and please tag us in any photos that you share, because I love admiring your stitches. We have a real thing for projects that you can finish in a night just like this, so be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any more of our fast and fun tutorials just like this. Happy crocheting!